People love blue resin in boards. Stick around and see how I made it. I started out by drawing some random lines down the center of this board, and if I had any goofs or rough areas on this board, I also carved those out randomly. It's meant to look kind of like a river running through it, so that was what I was attempting to do with the blue resin. As you can see, I'm using a small handheld DeWalt. It's a battery-powered router. It's the bit is, I believe it was like a 1/4 inch, so I had more control and it didn't grab as much. And I was just randomly cutting out the areas. As long as the base of the router sits flat on your board, you're going to be good. I sanded off the edges once I was done because there was little feathery pieces, so I wanted to make sure it was nice and flat and those wouldn't get in the way of the resin pour, which you'll see in a bit. I put the tape on the one end because you can see that routed section down the middle. And then I was doing a little bit more. I was going to take more out, and I decided against that. But the bit itself, I actually let it tip it sideways and let it plunge into the board. And this board is really hard, so I didn't have to do multiple passes. I think I only did about anywhere between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch deep. I didn't need to go deep with it. I knew the resin would stick because the wood was ready for that ability. So you can use a bunch of different kinds of tapes. In this case, I'm using a blue painter's tape. It holds nicely on the ends and it prevents the resin from flowing over and onto the floor. So if you watch any resin pours, you'll see that people do this to prevent the resin from pouring out and all over the place. And now that I have that blue tape in place, I'm leveling it and making sure that this board is dead flat so the resin flows evenly across the board. I'm also going to make it a little bit higher with a little surface tension so it's above the grade of the board itself. I mixed the resin off camera and I also added the blue. It's a midnight blue, very dark and rich, and I thought it was a perfect color complement to the kind of light yellowish color of the maple. When you make a pour, you really need to get those air bubbles out, and the best way I know to do it is by using a torch. This is just a typical propane torch that I use, and it does pull the air bubbles out. One of the good things about making a shallow pour is you don't have to worry about too many air bubbles, but you do have to pay attention to them because you don't want those. You'll end up making another pour and, well, it could be a real nightmare for you. So more shallow is good, and use a torch to pull out the air bubbles. Now I've moved on to sanding. So after 24, 48 hours, I sometimes let it go for, I do the sanding part. And I start with 80 grit and I move all the way down to, in this case, I moved all the way down to 800, which I ended up doing by hand. So using that 80 grit, I do sand it flat. That is the most aggressive sandpaper, as any of you woodworkers will know. And that is the one that I get flat with the board itself. And I sanded the entire surface down. I knew I was going to be resanding everything, so the surface getting flat was extremely important at this stage, the 80 grit stage. There's nothing like your fingers and touching something to make sure that it is flat and smooth. Now I move on to the, I think this was 120, 220, right? I move on to that and go to the next level of sanding. I am working on a new style charcuterie board that's all resin, and that will be coming up in a couple of weeks. I think you'll really like that one. I'm going to have handles on it. It's very thick. Subscribe and hit the bell button to see that. So 800 is the next level of sanding. This I did by hand. I used some of that black stuff. It's wet and dry. So I use this, and I fold this into quarters, and then I tear a little bit so I fold it in on itself. This gives me some rigidity when I'm using the sandpaper. I can hang on to it a little bit better, and it's small. It fits nicely in my hand, and this is a really nice way to use sandpaper in your hand and not lose it or get caught on something. It's more rigid, so it's nice to use it that way. I also fold it in on itself so I can use all four sides without them getting worn off. So sometimes I will take a piece of paper towel or workshop cloth or something like that and put naphtha on it, and that usually pulls off all of the, or tacky cloth, and that sometimes pulls off some of the dust. But because this maple was so hard, I really didn't have those issues. So I just swept it off with the little broom there in my hand. I knew it was pretty dust free, and I went over it now with the feed and wax, which is a great product. I'll put a link below to that in my description. That's it. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments below. Check out the description to make sure that you see all the links that I have and everything down there. And I'll see you next week. Thanks for watching.